Hello, welcome to Climate Code's workshop, Supercharge your UI with React, where you will learn all about the JavaScript library that is known as React. And I assume that you're here because you love web development and you have worked with HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and you absolutely hate everything because everything is just too complicated. Every time I want to do something, I have to read the HTML document, process in my JavaScript, then plug it back into the HTML, and that's just like way too much for you. So yes, this workshop will help you resolve those problems. And before we dive into the content of the workshop today, I'm just going to do a quick introduction. Hello, I'm Leo Tian. I am the web developer at the XCHacks Mini Core team, and I'm also the events coordinator at another organization called Curious. But since this isn't my resume, I guess I'll just go into my coding experience. So I am a front-end web dev enthusiast. I really love front-end web development. So I love React, obviously. I also just love, coding in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript just to see what I can make and, make things look really good. And that's my passion. And this will be the workshop agenda for today, but I'm going to state some assumptions that I have before I go through today's topics. So even though we are trying to leave vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, actually more so just HTML and JavaScript, you should have a decent foundation in HTML and JavaScript in order to understand today's content. So it's okay if you're not really good at those yet. If you have a decent understanding, you should be able to understand what's going on today. So yeah, let's dive right into it. So for today, we're going to go through mainly 4 steps for this workshop. So first of all, we'll go through what is React. I'll introduce you to the library, as well as why you should learn it. And second, we'll take a look at React Superpowers. So why is React so powerful? How does it work? And why do people like to use it so much? And then third, we're going to be learning React hands-on. So we're going to be writing our own JSX, our own components, and we're also going to be making use of some React hooks, which we'll go into later on. And finally, we'll take a look into React's use cases. We're going to talk about where you should use React, where you shouldn't, as well as some alternatives if you are seeking any of those. So first section. I have no idea what is going on. What the heck is React? So React is a JavaScript library that is used to create dynamic web applications. So basically applications that have a lot of uses. You have to navigate. There's a lot of buttons, you click around, and it just has a lot of functions. And React allows you to create interactive UI elements on your websites and potentially more if you're willing to dive into that. So what is React according to its own documentation? Well, React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces, as you already said. And React is declarative. Declarative means that you tell React what to do, and it handles most of it for you. So you tell React, do this, and you don't have to tell React how to do it. And the second part about React is that it is component-based. So you build components with defined logic that can be reused. So basically just if you have a similar snippet of code or a similar UI element, you can just plug in a component and that will basically be there for you instead of having to code it over and over and over again. And lastly, React is write anywhere. So React is really flexible and it can be used in almost any tech stack. And the stack just meaning the group of technologies that you are using. So that makes React a very good tool for basically all your web development projects. And why should you learn React? Well, React is a very powerful front-end library. It's very efficient. It saves a lot of money and time, and it just makes development a lot easier. And another thing, which is a little more advanced, is React Native. So if you're building a mobile application, instead of having to learn Java, to learn Swift just to make a separate Android or Apple application, what you can actually do is you can actually use React Native, which is very similar to React, and instead write all your mobile applications in that. So instead of having to learn 3 languages to develop 3 applications across different sites, not different sites, different platforms, you can instead learn one thing, which is React, and then have apps on all of those. And the second reason why you should learn React is that React is very popular in industry. It's used by many, many projects and many big projects. For instance, Facebook uses React. In fact, React is an open source project that is supported by Facebook. And the third reason why you should learn React is a mature and supported library. So React is tried and true, and it has lots of other supporting frameworks and packages, and it has a good community. So there's going to be a lot of answers to basically any of your questions, if you have any about React. And the last reason why you should learn React, because React is in high demand. So lots of jobs actually require SPA experience, like React, for instance. And on the job market, it's just a very valuable skill that you should have. And now that we went over why you should learn React, do you guys have any questions? I'll just take a look for a second. Nope. And no. Okay. I'll maybe just wait for like a few seconds. So one person says no questions. Okay, I'm assuming there's none for now. So another thing that we can go into is React superpowers, which is what makes React so powerful. So the first thing that makes React really powerful is JSX, which stands for JavaScript XML. So JSX is a very HTML-like syntax that basically allows you to write your HTML into your JavaScript, kinda. So you see React really leans into the idea of JavaScript only. So it tries to make everything as JavaScript as possible. So if we take a look at this example of JSX here that I have on my screen, if you just look at the first two lines, you're going to see that, wow, I can't even tell the difference. This looks just like HTML. But if you start looking downwards, you're going to see that there are a few things that are very slightly different. So the first thing that you might notice is that, hey, that div doesn't have a closing tag. And that's because basically in JSX, every tag can be self-closing, like you would normally do with maybe image or input. And instead of classes, you have the keyword class name instead to describe classes. And that's because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, so you don't want to be throwing that around in random places. JavaScript might get really confused. So instead we use class name. Another thing you might notice is that all the things in here that have like two words, instead of having a dash in the middle, it's all camel case. And that's really just to help JavaScript understand that it's not a minus sign and it's actually a single thing. And another really interesting function is that you can actually pass JavaScript values into your JSX by using curly brackets. So you can obviously imagine that that makes for a very, very powerful tool. And lastly, you can actually pass inline styles into your JSX as JavaScript objects. So instead of passing it as a string, you would do it in an object. And the second thing that makes React so powerful is a component. So you can define reusable components with custom props, custom logic, and also a custom output. So we have another example here with an example of a component. So you can see that there's the parent component and it takes in the props variable and number, and there's custom logic in the middle. And then afterwards, what it returns is JSX. So it returns a child, a child's component. And here we can incorporate our variables and the results of our custom logic into that output. And then the final thing, I would say this is what makes React, way better over vanilla JS and HTML, is that React makes state management really easy. And what we mean by state is basically just the state of your application, the values of all the variables in your application. So we can see here that we have a stateful component with something called useState, which is a hook that we'll go into later on. So React actually manages your component state. So you can easily click the button in this code, and then it will immediately change your state. So whereas in vanilla JS and HTML, if you wanted to change something in your document, you're going to have to get elemented by ID, element.innerHTML equals. In React, you don't really have to do that. Once you change your state, React automatically re-renders that specific part of the application for you. So if you, let's say if you call set state, it's going to change your state, and then React's going to go like, hey, that changed. And then it's going to basically just like renew that part of your application, and everything in there is going to be new and it's going to be changed, which is really cool. So basically, if you like click that button there, insisting saying React manages your nothing, it's going to instantly change to something. And then the last part that makes React really efficient is what is known as a virtual DOM. So React actually keeps separate track of your DOM, which stands for the document object model, how HTML is represented. It keeps a separate track of that in memory. So instead of directly manipulating the DOM, it actually changes a virtual DOM, which is then rendered onto the real DOM. And this process is much faster and makes state changes very, very efficient. And this allows you to have single page applications, which is SPAs, which means that you will not need to refresh your page when you access new data or when you go to a new path, because you can actually load these things in the virtual DOM, and then React's going to just change it in the browser DOM for you. So here's a very good illustration of what happens. So in React, it's going to detect a state change at a certain level at your application. It's going to compute the differences, and then it's going to re-render it into your actual DOM. Whereas your browser, it's just going to basically instantly change everything. And as you can imagine, that's not very efficient at all if you just change everything without even looking at it. And now that we've gone over, I guess, like the basics of React, let's learn how to code it. So if you just would follow along, we're going to do all our coding today in something called Code Sandbox. So if you want to know where to find that, you can just go on Google and you can go like Code Sandbox. And you just search that up. It should be the first thing that pops up. You can go into it. You can register an account. I'll just wait for a little bit because this is probably going to take a few minutes to set up. Let me know if you have any questions about what I just talked about, because I know that it may be potentially confusing. And also just let me know maybe in the chat when you are done and you are ready for Code Sandbox. And actually, normally I would talk about installing npm node and using create React app so you can actually run it on your local computer. But because today's workshop, we're on a time crunch when we have like a little over an hour maybe, I'm not going to do that because that's going to take a really long time. So if any of you are done setting up, you can just maybe send something in the chat so I know. Okay, so someone's ready. I'll just wait for maybe a few more people. I'll give it maybe like 3 more minutes. So just let me know in the Zoom chat if you are done. If you're in case anyone's messaging on Discord, I'm not actually looking at Discord right now. So you would have to do it in the Zoom chat. Just give it maybe a little more time. Okay, I think it's a good time to move on. So let's just dive into how to create your first React project using Code Sandbox. So if you're on the dashboard like I am, you should be seeing like a UI like this. And if you click New Sandbox, you should see somewhere down here that like in the official templates, there is React. And just click that. And then it should basically build up a basic React project for you. Just let it load. And let me know if this is working for you. Okay, I'm going to move on now. So before we get into anything fancy, like, start writing an application, let's take a look at the source file structure here. So basically all your coding is going to happen in these two files. So the first file that we can look at is public. And what public does is it's actually for template files and images. So here, if you just look at the index.html, it actually describes a lot of what's happening behind the scenes for you. So this file is basically a template. So what it does is it takes all your JSX and it renders it into your this HTML document when you're done. So this HTML file is a template. If you open it directly in the browser, you're going to see an empty page. And that's because there are certain processes that are required to render your JSX. So if you begin development and you run npm start or yarn start, it's going to run your React code, and it's going to like take this HTML document and it's going to be like, hey, here's all my JSX, plop, and then it's going to start working. And another thing that public actually, like the public folder actually does, is you actually store all your images here so that it can be accessed later on by your code. And then the second part that we should look at is the source file. So the source file is actually where basically all your coding will be. And perhaps the most important thing in here is index.js. So if we look at index.js, you're going to see like a bunch of stuff. And this is mainly what React is. And you're going to see like JSX here and stuff like that. So this is where all the rendering happens, and specifically React DOM.render. So if you just look at this, you're taking a root element from your document. So it's going to get an element with the ID of root, and then it's going to render this JSX. So the first argument of this function is what to render. And then the second argument that is passed is where I should render all this stuff. So right now we're rendering it into an element on the HTML with an ID of root. You can imagine that if I changed it in index.html, let's say I changed it, instead of calling it root, I called it location, and I changed it here to location, it would also work. So, that's pretty flexible. And then the other important part is if you look at the imports, you're importing something called app from this file here. And this is where we find our application. And you see here that this is actually a component. And what it returns is everything that you see here. Whoops. It returns hello code sandbox, start editing to see some magic happen. And of course, it doesn't have to be app.js. You could easily name this anything else as long as you change the name here and you change the import on the other end. Okay, so with that said, let's take a look at JSX. So looking through this stuff, you probably recognize, wow, this looks a lot like HTML code. And that's because it's JSX, and you can write JSX in almost the exact same way that you write HTML. So let's give it a try. So let's say, let's just, take this out perhaps. Wait, why is my keyboard in French? That is so sad. So let's say we want an H1 instead. And we can make this say, hello world, like the classic coders we are. And you can see that that is what's going to be rendered. And it's actually very similar to HTML in this aspect. And if I wanted to add perhaps, say, a class or an ID, let's go to ID first. If I wanted to add an ID, I'm going to do this in the same way as I do in HTML. So just ID equals maybe, header. And one thing that you may notice is the way that we import CSS into our React projects is we just do an import here. So we import styles.css, and that refers to the CSS right here. So if we change it so that we made it so that something with the ID of header gets a color of red, we can see that this here changes into red. So right now it's feeling really, really like HTML. And say instead of an ID, we wanted a class instead. And as I said before, class is actually a reserved keyword in JavaScript. You don't want to be throwing that around. So class, if you used like Python, Java, in fact, like any object-oriented language, you should know what a class is. So instead of class, we actually use class name so that JavaScript doesn't get confused. And you can see that right now it returned back to black. But if we just change the CSS document to reflect that it is a class, you can see that it turns red again. And one thing that you may have noticed is that I didn't need to click like this refresh button at all. It just automatically changes. And this is actually not something that Code Sandbox does. This is actually something related to React, because as I said before, React keeps track of your DOM virtually. So whenever there's like a file change, React's actually going to say, hey, something's different. It's going to compare it behind the scenes, and then it's going to just reflect whatever is changed and instantly replace it. And as you can imagine, this makes development really fast and really easy. And another thing that I would like to go into for right now is inline styles. So you may remember that in HTML, there's 3 ways that you can implement styles. The first one is to link external CSS, which we already did here. The second is to perhaps like write it in your header, which is something that we can't really do in React really, because there is no head, unless we do it in like index.html. That's not really not practical. And the third way we can do it is with inline styling. But if we just try to do like style, let's actually just erase all the CSS so we don't get confused. If we try to just do style the normal way, and we style, like, let's say color is blue, we're going to see that actually throws us an error. So it says that the style prop expects a mapping from style properties to values. So basically what it expects is a JavaScript object. And this is where we're going to introduce some new syntax here. When we do curly brackets, it's basically going to tell your React code that, okay, whatever is within these curly brackets, it's no longer JSX. This is actually JavaScript. So if we take this and we insert like a JavaScript object, which coincidentally has very similar syntax, we just do color is, and we can't actually just write red here because it's JavaScript, we need to make it a string. So the color is red. You can see that it actually reflects the changes in your application. And let's say we want to change the font size of this particular H1. We can do font. And because it's all camel case, we would do font size like that instead of with a dash in the middle. And then we could do font size like, let's say, 72, which is going to be ridiculously large. Yep. And you might notice that I didn't actually write 72px. That's because when I actually put a number here, React automatically deduces, okay, this is in pixels. And then it just puts it in pixels. So you can see here that React is very, like JSX is very similar to HTML. And that's what makes it potentially confusing for beginners, just because it's so similar. Yet there's these like tiny things that make it different. Like when I first started React, I kept writing the word class, and then my application would like randomly not work, and then I'd be very confused until I realized that I was doing class name wrong. Let me know if you have any questions up to this point. I'm just going to take a look maybe at the Q&A and maybe at the chat. So any questions? Okay, I'm going to assume that we don't have any questions at all. Oh, no again. Okay, sounds great. And okay, this looks pretty good. It's all pretty similar to HTML at the moment, and it seems we really like this. So at this point, let's try to add another tag. So let's try to add a p tag. And as I'm typing this, you might immediately start noticing that I'm getting some squiggly red underline that I really don't want to see ever whenever I'm coding. And oh no, adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. And why is that? So basically how React works behind the scenes is that JSX is actually parsed and rendered into functions. And realistically, you can only return a single thing for a function, because let's say if I define like two variables, I defined foo and I defined bar, and I tried to do like this syntax is never going to work for any programming language, because it's just going to get really confused. Like, okay, you're putting together two values, but you're not really telling me what to do with them. And usually you can only assign like one value to something. So this is basically the same case. So what you would need to do is you would need to wrap these two elements in like a div or something. So we can see that if we wrap these two elements in a div, which basically tells React, okay, this is now a single element that we're rendering here, we can see that it stops throwing us the error. Wow, that worked. But you may be thinking, Leo, what the heck? I don't want this random div sitting here. I just want my h1 and p tag. Because if we, we take a look into our app, we inspect elements, we can actually see that the div is actually there. But perhaps in a certain situation, you wouldn't want that div there because it completely messes up your UI. Well, in that case, there's actually another solution, which is just to make these tags empty. So this so like these empty tags, they're called React fragments. It basically tells your app that, okay, I have a fragment of code here. Even though they're two separate things, I actually want them, I want React to understand what I'm doing, even though I don't want an actual wrapper around it. And that helps your React say, okay, this is just one thing. Let me just pass that on as, as the return value of a function. And this is actually short for React.fragment. And the reason why it may not recognize what this is because we haven't imported React up here. But you can see that it serves a similar function. And now if we go check our application, there's the original div no longer exists, but of course it's still within root. So React fragment and just empty tags, they serve the same function. Okay, so that's pretty cool. What's next? Well, the other powerful feature of React that I mentioned before was that you could render JavaScript values directly into your JSX. So let's give a few examples. So let's say we define const foo equals hello Leo. And we wanted to plug that into here. And as I previously mentioned, first you're going to do the curly brackets to tell React that, okay, this is now JavaScript. It's not JSX anymore. So if I just put foo in here, we can see that, wow, we basically just plug this string directly into our JSX. And we can actually do this with like a variety of other things. Like we can have a number here, and that would make it 1. So, let's try some other things. What if I wanted to plug an object in here? Does that work? Unfortunately, objects are not valid React children. So, oops. How about arrays? Does that work? Let's just wait. And surprisingly, it actually does. And the reason behind that we'll actually go into later on in this workshop. So, okay, so we know that strings, numbers, and arrays work. And another interesting thing is that JSX are actually like sort of like like data types themselves. So if I want to do like a span, I can actually like, hey, this is now JSX, and I can say hello Leo. And you can see that it actually works. It's actually passing a span into our code. And if we just inspect elements again, we can see that this is actually the case. We're wrapping it around with a span. So you can imagine that this is very useful if I wanted to say like define the color. So equals color blue. You can see that this works. So yeah, that's pretty cool. We can do strings, numbers, arrays, and more JSX. And along that line, this is also how we actually comment in our JSX. So in JavaScript, you may know that there's a few ways of commenting. You can do // or you can do /*. And then that's just going to comment everything in between. This is going to comment a single line. This is going to comment everything in between. And in JSX, you might notice that your code just thinks this is like some text that you're typing in here. So what we actually do is we actually tell our JSX that, okay, this is now JavaScript. And then we put a comment in it, and now we can comment our code just like that. So, that's pretty cool. So now that we know all about JSX, well, not all of it, but now we know a decent amount of it, we can dive into creating our own application. So what we're going to make today is just like a grocery list. And let's start with defining what is in our grocery list. So I'm going to define const list. Of course, now this is going to break, so I'm just going to take that out for now. And let me just take out the styling. No, it's both grocery now. My grocery list. And we define the list as an array of, let's say, objects, because we want to say the name of this is, we want eggs. And then we have a certain number of eggs that we want to buy. Let's just say egg goes by the dozen and we want to buy 2 dozen eggs. And then we can, kind of copy the syntax over and over. So we want apples, we want maybe like 5 of them. And then we want milk, and we want 1 carton of milk. And that's all well and good. So basically we represented what we want in terms of a JavaScript array of objects. And now we want to render this into our JSX. And that's going to sound very complicated, because up to this point we've only been like putting in single elements at a time. So how are we going to turn this list of objects into individual JSX tags? And what we can actually do is we can actually, let's just say const JSX list. And we can actually take our original list and then we can map it. So basically mapping is just not map. Basically mapping is just, you're just looping through everything in this list and then returning whatever function you define after it. So we can take the item itself, which is basically just each of these individual things. And then we can map this into, let's just say, a paragraph tag. Then we can do, let's insert our item name into here, item.name times item.count. So basically what this is going to do is going to take every object in this, and then it's going to return some JSX. So remember how arrays, you can insert arrays into your JSX? Well, this is what it does. Basically, it takes the array and it just plugs every single element in the array into your JSX. So now that, let's just imagine that we change this into a div. And we plug in JSX list. Wow. It automatically inserts all the p tags that we just mapped into our application. And I guess I'm just gonna do a small breakpoint here to let me know if you have any questions. If nobody says anything, I'll assume that no, we don't have any questions. Okay, so no, we do not have any questions. Somebody replied. Okay, so let's move on. So we can actually see that it actually put 3 separate p tags into our application. Okay, so that's all well and good. And we want to make this more complicated, right? Because this is a grocery list. We can't just have a list of p tags. So we might want to make this more complicated by perhaps putting this in a div, and alongside our p tag, we want a checkbox as well. So we might put an input, and then type is equal to checkbox, and then we can just do the self-closing tag of slash right there. And it doesn't look very good for now, but we can see that now we have a checkbox for each thing. So we can say, like when we go to the store, we've now bought something. And I'm just going to clean this up a bit in terms of styling by doing some inline styles. If you want to follow along, feel free to. And that's just going to clean it up for us after it rebuilds. Okay, so now this looks pretty good. It's decent. And you might be thinking, okay, this is cool, but I don't want to see this big chunk of code in like this small logic, in this small logic section here. And also, I might want to reuse this sort of syntax later. So what am I going to do? I'm going to like just copy this around every time I need to use this. And the answer is no, you don't need to. You can actually build a custom component that houses all of this for you. So let's create a new component. So usually when we do that, we create a new file and create, let's say, item.js. I just put it in here. And the type of component that we're going to define today is called a function component. And so components are reusable and convenient, and that's why we want to use them. And function components just make it even more concise. The other type of components are like class components. They're like the OG React components. But now that there's function components, everything's just a lot simpler. So how we define a function component is we define, let's say, just a normal function. So const item is equal to a function. I'm going to use an arrow function here because that's how I like to do things. And how it works is that you would have the props at the top, the logic in the middle, and then whatever you return is going to be our JSX. So let's just copy this. It's going to throw me an error for a moment, but you can just wait. And then let us just reformat that. And right now you can see that, okay, this is kind of strange because item is not defined. So we can actually pass things as props. So let's say we put curly brackets here, and then we do item. Let's make sure that we export this as well. Export default item. And then we can just import it here. This should make an automatic import. Yes, it does. And okay, you can see that it's probably still going to say that item is undefined. But since that we have this item prop here, what we can actually do is we can actually make this very HTML-like syntax again. We just do item is equal to, what is it equal to? It's equal to this JavaScript object, which is here, that is also called item. So let's just do, we're passing into our item component. The item prop is equal to item. And that may be a little confusing. So let's just change this up a bit. Instead of calling it item, let's just call it name and count. So what we're passing in is a name and a count. And those changes also reflect here. So name is just item.name and count is equal to item.count. And here you can see that those changes are reflected here, and hey, it works again. So another thing that we should go over regarding components is that, first of all, we see this weird syntax here. This is actually something called, this is actually just React shorthand. So basically what's normally done is that we're actually passing in props, and props is an object that houses all these values, all these properties. So usually props.name and props.count. And this is how it would work. However, in JavaScript, we can actually do is instead of saying props, I'm going to put an object here. And then I can say name, and then I can say count. So when JavaScript sees this, it's going to say, OK, I expect an object with at least these two properties. And when we do pass in those properties via this syntax here, it's going to compare it and say, OK, so what's being passed in has a property with named mapped to a certain value. So I'm going to define a variable name, and then I'm going to put that value inside this variable. So now we can just do props. We can just do name and count, which is quite cool, the JavaScript thing. And another thing to note is that React has this follows this certain architecture. It's called one-way data bindings. Is that you can only pass data from parents to children. You can't pass it from children to parents. And this is a problem that's going to, show itself later on when we make this app. So just keep in mind, you can only pass data or information from parents to children. Okay, and let's just go over it again. The parameters to this function, which is a function component, the parameters are the props. And this is like basically you're just destructuring the object. So the logic goes in the middle, as we see here. We don't actually have any in item for now, but here, this would be like some of the custom logic that we have. And then return value is JSX. And then we're just plugging in some JavaScript values directly into our code. Okay, so that is done, and this works. And let's move on to the next step of adding some input and some buttons to the original application so that we can actually put new things into our grocery list. So let's actually create a separate component. You don't have to, you can just do this in the app if you want to, but for demonstration, I will, because there are some important things, lessons to be learned when I do this. So I'm going to say like grocery input.js. And the fun thing is actually, you can actually put JSX, and most IDEs are going to recognize that. So this is what it's supposed to be like, JSX, and you can see this like little React icon here. JSX is just the same thing as JS, except it fully supports, JSX. Because when you do this, when you try to put JSX into like a normal JavaScript that doesn't have Babel or like React, computer's going to get very, very confused. So with JSX, it definitely knows that it works. And functionality wise, it's pretty much the same. So since I'm too lazy to define my own thing again, I'll just copy this over. So much easier. So we're just going to do grocery input. And then that's going to be what we're exporting. And then what we want in here is like div with an input. Oh, okay. Input, and then a button that says add to list. And for now, this will take in no props. And if we just do the same thing, and then we plug in suppose grocery. Why did I write a slash there? So that should make an automatic import. And that is a closing tag because that's just a component with no children. So now we have something here. And something to note about children is that when you actually define your own custom component, there's something that is known as children. So let's just say we don't want name, we just want children instead, and then we're going to put our children here. So what children does, it takes in a React node, which can either be, as we talked about, a string, a number, an array, or a JSX element. Actually, the array can be either an array of strings, an array of numbers, or an array of JSX elements. That's just something to note. And we can actually do this. So if we pass in some children via this kind of sort of syntax, we can see that, hey, that also works because this is the child of the item component and children is here. So that's a fun thing. Okay, now moving back to our input. So this is our input. Yay, we have an input and we have a button. So that looks like it's going to work. But now we run into two problems actually. And those two problems are, okay, so we have like this value inside this input. How do we access it? And also, what if this part of the app happens to re-render because we talked about re-rendering in React. Like if some part of the state changes, it might re-render like this, like some part of this application. What if the input is re-rendered? Is what we put in all gone then? And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to introduce you to a new idea, which is the idea of React hooks. And that's like our first React superpower, useState. So a state is a value that is maintained between renders. So basically, when something is rendered, re-rendered, the state is going to stay the same. And it's not going to change throughout renders, unless, of course, you call a function to change it. And any changes in the state will trigger re-render. So basically what that means is anytime the state is changed, your React application is going to be like, okay, replug that value in so it reflects the new value of that variable. And this is actually done using the useState function. So let's put that in here. And the way you do it is actually you would do const and then array, and then of, let's say, value, and then set value, which is kind of just, let me just put this first. There we go. And then this is supposed to be a function. And let's just go over the syntax here. So the way that you're supposed to name these variables is supposed to name this like something. You can name this anything. You can name it value. You can name it grocery name, whatever. And then you have to like have another, and this is actually a function. This is a value. This is a function. And this function is usually called set, and then whatever you called this variable. So here we call it set value. And then finally we have useState, which is what we call to get to like kind of define a variable in some sort of sense. And what you put in this function is what is the default value. So let's make the default value here an empty string. Okay, so another thing you might notice is that we're defining this using a const. So that basically means that we can't do value equals like new. This is like bad. You don't want to do this in like your JavaScript. You don't want to try to assign new values to your constants. And that's going to actually throw us an error. So you can basically think of value as defining a variable. And the way that you want to like make a new value for this variable is you want to call this function using set value into new. And if I plug it in here, that's actually going to throw me an error because whenever this re-renders, it's going to change the state. Sorry, set. I shouldn't have the value equals here. Just call set value, please. Don't do this. So I believe this is actually going to throw me an error. Yeah, because whenever it's re-rendered, it's going to set the value again. And whenever it sets the value, it's going to say, okay, something changed, re-render, something changed. So don't ever put your set value in a place where it can potentially cause infinite loops. Okay, so how we would actually implement this state into an input is we would say that the value of the input, which is something you also see in your HTML. So the value is just equal to, like, for now, it's just equal to an empty string. And something that you might start to notice is that if you try typing into the input, nothing's going to happen because, well, the value here is always going to be an empty string. And how we change that is you actually do onChange, which is also something that is there in HTML. And you might notice that right now, it's actually in camel case instead of all lowercase, equals a function, which you also do in HTML. It's where the event, and then we say set value to e.target.value. So this basically tells your application that, okay, so this value of the input is equal to the value variable. And whenever the value inside this input changes, it sets the value to the new value. So now we can see it works. And another really good thing is now we can actually read whatever is in this input, because whatever is in this input is just equal to value. So you can imagine that if we added like an onClick here, we can actually say, like, let's say alert value. And one thing you might notice is, yeah, this stuff is all, it's maintained between renders. Like whenever you change this file, this still stays the same. And when we click add to list, wait a second. Oh, wait, whoops, typo. When we click this, it actually says whatever is in this input. So now, yay, we can access this variable basically. And that's all well and good. And maybe what we want to do instead is whenever we receive some sort of input, and then we click add to list, what we want to do is we want to empty this input and then plug this new value into our list. So let's just, and remember, you can only pass down you can only pass down your data from the top to the bottom. So we can't actually say, okay, let's pass this value upwards into our application and then add it here. You need to either do one of two things. So one thing is you can either, what is called lifting the state. So basically, instead of using useState here, we actually do useState up in our app, and then we pass down value and set value so that I can make the corresponding operations. But the other thing we can do is we can actually, pass our list down. And let's try that. So let's say that we are now receiving list. And then now we can say that here list is list. So we're passing down a list variable. And whenever we click this button, we're going to mutate the list. And then we're going to add something to the end of it. So what we're going to do is going to add a very simple, so we're going to add a new thing, which the name is just the value. And then the count, I'll just be lazy. I won't define a separate input. I'll just make it 1. Then what we want to do is want to clear whatever's in the input. So we do set value to nothing, to just an empty string. And if we click this, okay, that's weird. It empties the array, but it doesn't add anything to the list, and it's not re-rendering. Can somebody tell me why? Like, what's the problem with what I'm doing here? What is the problem with what I'm doing in this application? Why is it not adding my input to this list, even though here clearly I'm pushing something into the array? Can somebody just like throw their thoughts in the chat? Why? Why do you think that this is the case? Does anyone have any thoughts? If you don't know, you can just say, I don't know. I just want to like maybe see you guys just to know that you're listening and paying attention. Give it maybe like a minute. Any thoughts on why it doesn't work? Well, since no one has an answer, I'll just explain it, I guess. So the problem is what's happening here is, first of all, we're just straight up setting the value of list. We're not actually telling React that it should re-render. And the second problem is because list is just a variable and it's not a state, as we mentioned before, whenever this needs to re-render, it's going to redefine list and it's just going to revert it back to the original state. So what we actually want to do here is we actually want to make this some sort of state as well. So we want to do like list and then set list. And then we want to do useState here. Instead. And it's okay, there we go. So now that we've made this a state, it should maintain the values between re-renders. But it still doesn't work because we're not using setList. We're trying to change the list itself, which, as I previously mentioned, doesn't fare very well. So what we can do is instead of passing list, we can pass setList instead. So instead of saying list.push, what we can do is we can say set list. And here I'm going to introduce another method of setting the value. We can actually, instead of passing the value itself, we can actually pass a function whose first argument is the existing value of this state. So this would be the list. And the function will return an array with the destructured list. So basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, just pass me the rest of this list, and then I'm just going to plug it into this array, and then something new with the name of the value, and then count is 1 in the end. And you can see that with this setup, if we say like we want peaches, and we click add to list, it actually adds a peach. And yeah, so that's really cool. And since we're running out of time for this workshop, one thing that I would maybe like to make a note of is that in the item, you might notice that the checkbox doesn't actually have like a state associated with it. So that's prone to like all sorts of errors. Like it's just going to be like gone sometimes. Like I checked it, when it reloads, it's going to uncheck itself. And that's going to cause a lot of hassle. So when you actually build your own app, what you might think of is defining some custom logic here that is going to keep track of your checkboxes. And something else that I wouldn't have time to go over is another hook called useEffect. So useEffect in class components is the equivalent of lifecycle methods. And they're basically functions that run when a component is first loaded, when it updates, and when it's unloaded. So basically when it first appears, when it re-renders, and when it disappears. And this is pretty common, so I suggest you maybe like read it yourself. It's just called useEffect. You can search it up. It's in the React documentation. But I don't want to demonstrate it here due to time constraints. And as you can see, 1 hour is hardly enough to completely learn React. I've barely scratched at the surface here. And React actually has some pretty good documentation and has some pretty good tutorials on YouTube or even on like the documentation itself that I really suggest you look at if you're interested in further learning this library. Okay, so let's head back to our presentation. So we already did the hands-on demo. So number 4, React use cases. So as we discussed before, React can be used for almost any web application that you can think of, but it's not necessarily for every web application. It's not necessarily the most optimal solution. So as the dad of a very wise YouTuber once said, use the right tools for the right job and not vice versa. So let's go over some React do's and don'ts. So what you want to make with React is applications with a lot of user interaction. So you want to have things like dynamic web apps that require a lot of functions and a lot of like user interactions. And maybe like even if you want to make mobile applications, React Native really helps you with that. And that is something that you do want to do with React, like things that have a lot of state changes, that have a lot of different things going on at the same time in your UI. And one thing that you don't want to use for React is you just have, like a showy website. You don't want to use it for a static site, nor do you want to use it for a blog site. So an example of a static site is perhaps like the XD Hacks mini site, where basically you're just scrolling through things, nothing's really changing too much. Or like a personal site where you just want to show off your portfolio. There just doesn't have to be too much interaction. There's just, a few buttons sprinkled around. And another place where you don't want to use React is in a blog site. And that is mainly because of what is called search engine optimization. Because React has all this like JavaScript, it doesn't actually like load it into the HTML instantly per se. So what happens is when the browser looks at your code, you're like, okay, that's empty because nothing's rendered there yet. It's just going to leave and you're never going to reach the first page with Google. And the reason why you don't want to use it for static sites is because instead of loading straight up HTML and CSS, what React does is you're actually going to load like a bunch of JavaScript into your client. And that's obviously going to slow down the process for people with, like slower internet. If people are using 3G, React might take forever for them to load. And that's really, really bad. You don't want that. So for these reasons, you really don't want to use React for static sites and blog sites because it's going to seriously hurt your performance. And if you really don't like React after this workshop, like you're like, Leo, why would I want to learn React? It sucks. Like your presentation sucks. Therefore, React sucks. And okay, I'm going to go over some main alternatives that you might be interested in. So the few things I would like to mention is the biggest front-end frameworks there obviously are. So there's React, which is right here. There's Angular, there's Vue, there's Svelte, and there's HTML. So in terms of the job market, React, Angular, Vue, and HTML5, they're all very prevalent technologies, and they're probably going to get you a job. Whereas Svelte is something that's like just recently developing. So you're probably not going to find a job issue that easily, at least, if you use Svelte. And the second thing is how opinionated a framework or library is. So you can see here that Angular and Vue are a little opinionated. And when I say opinionated, it just means that they want you to do things a certain way. So with an opinionated framework, you're going to lose like a tiny amount of flexibility. But by losing that, you're going to actually gain a pretty good amount of safety. Because like if you don't know how to code like a good React app yourself, you're going to be like prone to being hacked. And believe me, you don't want to be hacked because that's like a horrible, horrible, horrible thing to happen to you. But for things like Angular or Vue, they have like certain things to prevent that. So in terms of flexibility, React, Svelte, and HTML are definitely good choices. For Angular, Angular is more opinionated, Vue is slightly less opinionated. So for these things, you're going to lose like that tiny bit of flexibility. But by doing that, you're going to gain a good amount of security. And in terms of speed, all of these frameworks and also just vanilla HTML is really good at like speed. Like they're all very good. They all operate very smoothly on your normal computer. It's not like with my computer, if I run a React app, I'm going to notice like, hey, that loads like 5 seconds slower. That's not going to happen. Like maybe there's going to be like a few milliseconds of difference, but you know, I'm a human. I can't notice that. And just a few things to note. Svelte is actually fairly close to a static site itself because of the way that it works. So if you want to build a blog or something, or like a personal site that you want to run really fast without like people in like places with bad internet, they're using 3G, you want it to load really quickly, Svelte is a good front-end framework for that. And the last thing that you want to consider when choosing a framework is your own sanity, because obviously if you choose a bad framework, you're going to be like losing brain cells. You're going to be like, oh my God, why is this not working? So what is good for your sanity? React is good for your sanity. Angular is good for your sanity. Vue is good for your sanity. Svelte is good for your sanity. HTML5 not so much, because as we went through before, you have to do like a lot of complex operations that are like, you know, pretty wishy-washy sometimes. And you don't want to like be reading things constantly and then like plugging it back in. That's just not the best way to do things. So if you want to like make a really interactive web application, use like a front-end web framework that helps you with your UI. And also another thing to note is that, you know, if you're in terms of your team, if everyone there is good with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but nobody knows how to use React, now is probably not a very good time to make the switch. Believe me, I've tried it. For my first hackathon, I was like, hey, I just learned React recently. Let's make our entire project in React. And the problem was none of my teammates knew React. So I ended up basically coding the entire project. Well, they were still very supportive people. They did a good amount of work, but like it was very tiring. So, you know, probably don't want to do that. So React compared to some of these other frameworks, just one thing, it's very flexible. React everywhere, it's not opinionated. And because React is a library and everything else here is actually a framework, React offers a little, it's only like part of what all these frameworks usually do. And React has like other like frameworks built on top of it, like Next or Gatsby, that does help with some of these things. But React is overall like a slightly lighter package. And it offers slightly less functionality for the sake of more flexibility. Okay, and now that you just learned React, you're like, oh my God, this is like awesome. What can I do next? Well, here are some next steps for you. So first thing that you might want to do is you might want to learn about class components, because class components are the OG React components. And by learning about them, you can actually solidify your understanding of how React works. So make sure you give those a look, maybe on the React documentation or on a YouTube video. And the second thing that you might be interested in is React hooks. So as we talk about, hooks are like some things like useState, useEffect, and they're also like useContext and useRef, which are a little more complicated and advanced. So if you're interested, you might also want to learn about them. And the third thing that you want to do if you want to like further your understanding of React is by learning more React frameworks. So things like Next, Gatsby, Material UI, and these things will really help you build better React apps. Like Next allows you to make server-side rendered applications. Gatsby allows you to make static sites. A Material UI just makes your app look that much better. So make sure you take a good look at those. And then the last thing that you might want to look at is perhaps like another framework. You don't want to be that guy who sits there and like thinks every other framework is inferior to your own and tries to start flame wars everywhere because they're like, yeah, my framework is better than all of you. Don't be that guy. That guy is very, very annoying. So what I would suggest is I would actually suggest you take a look at perhaps like another framework, maybe like Angular, Vue, or Svelte, and then you can decide yourself which one's better after you have experience with all those frameworks. Another reason why you should learn more of these is that, you have more skills. You're going to be more valuable as an employee and stuff like that. And speaking of Vue, actually, here's actually another hackathon opportunity for you if any of you are interested. Like the three of you, like the three participants remaining that are sitting there, good job for like going through the entire workshop. I'm very, very proud of you. And if you're really that passionate about like hackathons, maybe you would be interested in Curious Hacks Summer Edition, which is a hackathon that I'm helping organize. It's run by Curious. You may or may not have heard of it. You may or may not be part of that community, but it's like a hackathon for social good where we team up with a bunch of nonprofits. So if you're really keen on making like real social impact, make sure you join this hackathon. And we're going to have a Vue workshop there. So if you're interested in learning more about, the front-end frameworks, you're just a real front-end enthusiast like I am, make sure you attend. And finally, just thanks for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, you can ask in the chat right now. I can stay for maybe like another 10 minutes if you want. And you can connect with me via my email or via my LinkedIn. And of course, credits to SlidesGo because I use their slide templates. And if I don't say this, it's probably illegal. So, gotta thank SlidesGo. And the last people I would like to thank is to thank the organizers for Climate Code, because this is obviously like a really, really awesome event. I really love how like you guys put together a hackathon, and it's just overall great.